Ash Ketchum has just returned to the Kanto region from Kalos with his friends John, Bonnie, Clemont, and Serena. As they walked down the street heading towards Pallet Town, Clemont and Serena stayed a couple steps behind Ash, John, and Bonnie, and Ash said, "We're almost to my hometown, you guys. Man, I can't wait to introduce you to the friends I've made all on my Pokemon journey." "I agree with you on that one, Ash. It has been a while since we've been to your hometown," said John. Bonnie then said that she was excited and couldn't wait either. Clemont exhaled heavily and said, "All the same, I'm tired and it's almost lunchtime." Just then, they heard the grumbling of 5 stomachs, meaning that their stomachs agreed with Clemont and they all sat down to eat lunch. "Hey Ash, I know you said this already, but remind me how you and John met," said Bonnie as they got their lunch out of their bags. John and Ash looked at each other, then back Bonnie and Ash said, "Okay, it all started in Viridian Forest." Flashback to Viridian Forest, many years ago. "I just caught my Butterfree, back when it was a Caterpie. My friend Misty, who wasn't my friend yet, she was traveling with me because I owed her a bike. As we were blabbering on about the bike, a boy jumped out in front of us and said, 'Hey there, my name is John and I challenge you to a battle.' I was like, 'All right, I want to get stronger for the Indigo League.' John then said as he readied a Pokeball, 'Well, let's go Pidgeotto.' As the Pokeball opened, the Pokemon came out and appeared in a flash of light, and the Pokemon extended her wings and it screamed, 'Pidgeotto.' I then looked at Pikachu and asked if he was ready, and tiny sparks shot out of his body to show me that he was ready. I then said, 'Okay Pikachu, I choose you.' Pikachu then jumped off my shoulder, ready to battle with John. John started off the battle by saying, 'Pidgeotto, use wing attack.' Pidgeotto obeyed John and used wing attack on Pikachu. But I told Pikachu to dodge the attack and use Thundershock. Pikachu obeyed my command and dodged the attack and used Thundershock, which was a direct hit on Pidgeotto. As Pidgeotto slowly got back up, he tried to flap his wings, but Pidgeotto was paralyzed. I then said, 'Pikachu, use Thundershock one more time.' Pikachu jumps off a stump and uses Thundershock, hitting John's Pidgeotto, and we won the battle. Back to the present. When the 3 of us arrived at Pewter City, John asked if he could join us on our journey, and he's been with me ever since. At every Pokemon gym we visited, I battled them first, then John battled them the next day," said Ash. John then said, "But you're forgetting who was able to get farther than you in every league." "But not in Kalos. I got to the final round and I battled Alon," Ash replied with smugness in his voice. John rolled his eyes and said, Yeah. You did battle Alon, but I managed to get into the top 8. That was when I lost to Alon and he got to the semifinals, and eventually the finals where he faced Ash." Bonnie's eyes sparked as she said, "Wow, the 2 of you have been traveling for a long time." "Well, to be completely honest, I only challenged Ash because I could tell he was an aura user," replied John. "Hey Clemont, can I talk to you for a moment?" asked Serena. When Clemont said sure and the 2 of them got out of hearing distance, John said, "You know that those 2 have been secretive these past few days. I'm going to find out why." Ash and Bonnie nodded their heads because they had food in their mouths. As John got up and began walking away, Ash swallowed the food in his mouth and said, "Be careful, John." John looked back, nodded his head and said, as Don always said, "No need to worry." John then went off to find Serena and Clemont. When he did find Serena and Clemont, he heard Serena say, "We still need Alon, Gary, Sawyer, May, and John on our side, but you are certain that Bonnie will join us?" Clemont reassured her by saying, "I am very positive that Bonnie will join us when we confront Ash and we force him to give up his dream of becoming a Pokemon master. I mean, even his mother agrees with us." John was shocked. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Serena and Clemont are going to betray Ash, along with some of his other friends, and Ash's own mother. "I need to warn Ash," thought John as he ran back to Ash and Bonnie. When he got back to Ash and Bonnie, John said, "Listen here right now, Ash. I would never betray you, telling you this now." Ash got confused and said, "Okay, I believe you, but why would you say that?" John then told Ash and Bonnie everything that he heard. Ash's face went from a face of confusion to a face of anger for being betrayed. Bonnie placed her hand on Ash's shoulder and she said, "Ash, I would never betray you either." Ash managed to get a small smile on his face and said, "Thank you both." John then said, "As for who is planning to betray you, I do not know, but I know this, that they still needed Gary, Alon, Sawyer, May, and myself." "Don't worry, John. We'll find out when we get to my house. Here come Clemont and Serena," said Ash. Bonnie and John turned and saw that Ash was correct. Serena and Clemont were on their way back. John then said, "Let's get our things together." Ash and Bonnie agreed with John and gathered their things. When Serena and Clemont got their things together, Ash said in an angry voice, "Let's get going. The sooner we get to my house the better." Serena and Clemont were confused about why Ash sounded angry and tried to get an answer from John and Bonnie, but even they wouldn't say. As the 5 traveling companions entered the outskirts of Pallet Town, John said, "So Ash, when we get to your house, there's a technique I want to teach you." Ash said that he was excited to learn a new technique for controlling his aura. Bonnie was confused about what John and Ash meant and John saw she was confused and he said, "You see Bonnie, both Ash and I are aura users, meaning we can read people's aura and understand what Pokemon say and how they feel. Yeah, and I really want to use Thunderbolt on those 2 traitors behind us," said Pikachu. Ash petted Pikachu's head and he said, "Don't worry, buddy, you can do it when I say now, Pikachu." Bonnie was confused again until she remembered that John just said that Ash and John could understand Pokemon talk and said, "I take it Pikachu wants to use Thunderbolt on the 2 people behind us." John smiled while Ash said, "Yeah, that's right. Is it possible that Bonnie's an aura user too?" said Pikachu. John shook his head and said, "No, Pikachu, Bonnie isn't an aura user like me or Ash. Even if she was, she's too young for us to detect her." Just then, Ash saw someone running towards them and he recognized who it was as the person was. It was his little sister, Emma. When Emma got to Ash, John, and Bonnie, she gave her older brother a hug and said, "Welcome back, Ash, you too, John." "Thanks, Emma, but why didn't you wait at your house for us?" said John. Emma told the group that a bunch of Ash's friends arrived and wanted to talk to him. When Ash asked Emma, "Who is all at our house?" Misty, Brock, Gary, May, Max, Dawn, Iris, Sylvan, Barry, Tracy, Paul, Trip, a guy named Alon, and a guy named Sawyer. She replied, "Well, let's get this over with," said Ash. John and Bonnie agreed and all 6 of them went inside the house. When Ash walked in, what Emma was right. Alon, Barry, Brock, Sylvan, Dawn, Gary, Iris, Max, May, Misty, Paul, Tracy, Trip, and Sawyer were all waiting for him to arrive, and when she saw him enter the room, Misty walked up to him and said, "Ash Ketchum, we need to talk." Ash looked at John and Bonnie, who had just gotten their partners out, Scizor for John and Dedenne for Bonnie. I'm making Bonnie older than she was in the anime so Clemont could give Bonnie Dedenne's Pokeball. Closing parenthesis. Ash then looked back at the bigger group and said, "Really, Waterflower, does it have something to do with the fact that you and several others want to force me to give up my dream of becoming a Pokemon master?" Misty and Brock's faces showed a look of surprise after Ash finished speaking. Misty's face then showed a look of anger as she turned to Clemont and Serena, to which Clemont said, "We didn't tell him, we're just as surprised as you are." John then said, "That's because you didn't make sure that your surroundings were cleared." That was when Clemont and Serena remembered they heard rustling near some bushes. "We heard rustling near some bushes, but we thought that it was a wild Pokemon." "That's wrong. I followed you 2 and overheard you 2 talking about betraying Ash. After which I ran back to camp and told Ash and Bonnie everything." "Yeah, big bro, and I'm surprised at you and Serena," said Bonnie. Clemont was confused at Bonnie's statement and said, "What do you mean?" Bonnie then said, "I mean that I'm surprised at you 2 for betraying Ash and if I would betray him too." Serena turned her attention to Clemont and shouted, "You said that you were very positive that Bonnie would join us when we confronted Ash." Clemont placed his hand up and said, "I thought she would." Ash smiled at Clement's predicament, but showed a look of serious and said, I also know that you still needed Alon, Gary, May, Paul, Trip, and Sawyer to join you guys. Now my question for them is this. Did you choose to join them? May was the first to speak and she said, Ash, there is no way I would live with myself if I betrayed you. May then walked over and stood next to Ash and she said, besides, how would Manaphy feel if he found out his mother betrayed his father? Ash blushed at that fact but stopped blushing when Gary said, Ash, me and my grandpa are standing with you, there is no way that I would get in your way. That goes double for the rest of us that they haven't convinced yet. Said Paul as he, Gary, Alon, Trip, and Sawyer walked over to stand by Ash. Misty's anger boiled over and she said, you people are stupid for siding with him. John walked over to Misty and punched her in the face and she fell to the ground. John then said, that was for calling my friends stupid. Also for betraying Ash. Brock ran to Misty and helped her up. But you want to know what really surprises me right now? Said John. When Ash asked, sure John. What really surprises you right now? John replied, Brock not trying to flirt with Misty since he's flirted with every Officer Jenny, every Nurse Joy, and every lady, married or not, because he hasn't yet recognized her as a slut. May and Gary both tried to hold back from laughing, but Ash and Emma couldn't help but bust out laughing. John then said while looking at Delia, also the fact that you are on the side that is against your son. A good mother should defend her son, not try and put him down in his spirit. Ash then placed his hand on John's shoulder and said, it's time for us to go, John. As Ash and his still loyal friends made for the door, Clemont and Serena said, you're not leaving yet, Breakson, let's go. Clemont then said, Chespin, you too. The Pokemon they called out came out of their Pokeballs and their trainers said, Breakson, use Flamethrower. Chespin, Pin Missile. The two Pokemon looked at each other, nodded their heads, and used the move that they were told to use. But instead of hitting Ash and his still loyal friends, they turned and used the move they were told to use on their Pokeballs, destroying them, before they walked over to Ash and his friends. Serena and Clemont were shocked that their Pokemon left them. Ash smiled, looked at John and said, I bet that was the trick you wanted to show me. John nodded his head and said, yeah, I used my aura to talk to Breakson and Chespin telepathically and asked if they never wanted to betray you and they said yes, they're on our side. That's a load of Tauros crap, you're not an aura user just as much as Ash is a Pokemon master. Said Brock. Serena then said, Breakson, are you really leaving me? Breakson nodded her head and said, you bet you loser, you can't even become Kalos queen. But Serena didn't understand what Breakson was saying but John and Ash did, and John said, basically to sum it up what Breakson said was you're a loser Serena and she brought up the fact that you were the runner-up for Kalos queen. Now for you Clemont, your inventions always blow up and even one time thought I took a Macron when I didn't. Why don't you stop trying not to learn from your previous mistakes and actually make inventions that don't blow up? Said Chespin. Like Serena, Clemont didn't understand what Chespin said until Ash said, basically he said to learn from your mistakes and stop creating inventions that blow up. Ash then said, now Pikachu. Pikachu then jumped off Ash's shoulder and used Thunderbolt on all the traitors, paralyzing them for long enough for Ash and his friends to get out of the house. When they got outside, Ash said, we need to get my Pokemon. Already taken care of Ash. Gramps and I gathered your Pokemon together and told them what was going down. We then returned them to their Pokeballs and we gathered them in this bag and he told me to give you this. Gary then reached into his bag after giving the bag with all of Ash's Pokemon in it and pulled out a new Pokédex. Gary then handed the new Pokédex to Ash and said, this new Pokédex has no carrying limit, so you can use any of your Pokemon as you wish, but if you're in a 6-on-6 Pokemon battle I recommend that you watch which Pokemon you choose. Ash smiled and said, thanks, Gary, now let's get out of here. Where are we going to go? Asked Paul. I think we should head to Kalos and inform Clement's father and Serena's mother about what has happened. Said John. Are you sure it's not just to tell Shauna about how you really feel for her? Said Ash in a sly tone. John's face turned a bright red until he said, well, are you going to tell May that you love her? Both Ash's face and May's face turned bright red. John got his satisfaction when Emma laughed and said, I can't believe he got you back about the Shauna comment. But before Ash could even respond, May Kurtman pulled Ash into a kiss. Several whistles could be heard from the guys. When Ash and May parted, May Kurtman said, I love you too, Ashy Poo. The guys and Bonnie couldn't help but laugh. That just caused Ash to blush even redder. Suddenly the laughter was broken when the door to Ash's house opened and Misty came stumbling out, still under the effects of the thunderbolt. John then said, we'll talk about this later, let's get out of here. Ash and the others agreed and ran out of Pallet Town. After running into Celadon City, Ash and his friends went into Celadon Airport to get airplane tickets to Kalos. When the ticket saleswoman rang up the tickets, she said, you will be on Flight 106 and that plane won't leave for a couple of hours, so why don't you relax in the airport's cafe? Ash and his loyal friends took the advice and walked over to the airport's cafe. As they ordered their drinks, John said, what are going to do about Braixen and Chespin? I mean, they're technically wild Pokemon. I agree with John, who would catch them? Said Paul. Everyone was quiet until Ash said, why don't we ask them who they want to catch them? John smiled and said, I like that idea. Ash then knelt to look at Braixen and Chespin and asked them, who do you guys want to catch you? Chespin ran over to Bonnie while Braixen stayed by Ash. Looks like Chespin wants Bonnie to catch him and Braixen wants you to catch her, Ash. Said John. Bonnie smiled and said, do you really want me to catch you, Chespin? Chespin nodded his head and said, yes, Bonnie, I do want you to catch me since I was your brother's Pokemon, figure I would work best with you. For once, Bonnie understood Chespin and John knew it by the expression on her face. Bonnie smiled, and she said, okay, go, Pokeball. When the Pokeball hit Chespin, he went inside it and after 3 shakes, the Pokeball made a ding sound. Bonnie then picked up the Pokeball and she jumped up while saying, I caught a Chespin. John smiled, and he said, you were right, Pikachu. Bonnie is an aura user. Said Ash with a look of surprise on his face. John nodded his head and he said, she is, aura users give off a specific glow and it's blue. John then used his aura to show Ash, himself, and Bonnie all outlined in a blue glow. John then looked at Bonnie and he said, Bonnie, I couldn't tell if you were an aura user or not because normally, aura users could be able to identify other aura users by age 15. While you are 12 years old, Bonnie, you are an especially special case. Bonnie smiled, jumped up and down and said, wow, I'm an aura user. Ash smiled, looked back at Braixen and said, you ready, Braixen? Yes, I'm ready to join you and Greninja. But before you catch me, you must know that Serena and Clemont didn't ask us if they should betray you. All their Pokemon were out of their Pokeballs and we all saw Serena and Clemont agree to betray you and forced us to keep it a secret. I am sorry for not telling you sooner. Said Braixen. Ash told Braixen that it was all right, and he forgave her. He then pulled out an empty Pokeball and held it out towards Braixen. Braixen then pushed the button on the Pokeball and went inside it. After 3 shakes, the Pokeball made a ding sound and Ash said, all right, I caught a Braixen. John then said, that's good for you both. Yeah, but now I want you to teach me everything you taught Ash. Bonnie said to John. John told Bonnie that he would be more than happy to teach Bonnie his techniques. John then said, I just thought of something. When Ash asked John what he had in mind, John said, Greninja doesn't know about the betrayal. He's still helping Squishy and Z2 deal with those roots in Kalos. We need to tell him about the betrayal. So, it's a really good thing we're going to Kalos. Said May. Ash nodded his head and said, yeah, besides, I bet Braixen would be happy to see him again. Everyone laughed at Ash's comment and waited for their flight to be ready. Back at Ash's house, the traitors were just getting over Pikachu's thunderbolt. Misty then said, I'm going to kill that motherfucking electric mouse. I know, but why in the world would Ash's rivals side with him? Asked Max. I don't know, but we need to get to Kalos and talk to Greninja. I have a plan, said Clemont. Well, let's get his Pokemon from Professor Oak's ranch and use them against Ash, suggested Tracy, and everyone was on board with that and made their way to Professor Oak's Pokemon Ranch. Back with Ash and his loyal friends after a few hours of waiting, they just got on Flight 106 and they made their way to Kalos, and it was almost dinner time when Flight 106 landed at Lumio's airport. As the gang made their way to Professor Sycamore's lab, May Kurtman said, "So Ash, who is this Professor Sycamore person we're going to see?" Ash stopped, turned around, and said, "Professor Sycamore is the head Pokemon researcher in the region. He's the one who I got my Greninja from when he was a Froakie." John then said, "He studies Pokemon Mega Evolutions, it's kind of his specialty." "Yeah, he also helped save the world from being destroyed by Team Flare and Lysandre. He was a big help," said Bonnie. May then said, "Oh, he seems really nice." "You all talking about me?" said a voice from behind the group, and when they turned around, they saw a man in a lab coat with a Garchomp standing behind him. Ash, Alon, Bonnie, John, and Sawyer all knew who he was, and Ash said, "Professor Sycamore." "Hi Ash, how have you been?" said Professor Sycamore. "I've had better days," replied Ash. When Professor Sycamore asked Ash what he meant, John explained about most of his former friends betrayed him and wanted him to give up his journey. Serena and Clemont were with the traitors. Professor Sycamore was shocked to hear that and said, "I don't believe it." "Believe it, Professor, because it's the truth," said Alon. Bonnie then said, "We actually came here to get Ash's Greninja, tell Serena's mother about Serena, and tell my dad about Clemont." "Well, I'm just on my way to meet with your father and Serena's mother for dinner right now. Why don't you join me?" said Professor Sycamore. Ash and his friends said sure and walked with Professor Sycamore to meet up with Serena's mother and Clement's father. A little while later, Professor Sycamore and the gang arrived at where he was going to meet Serena's mother and Clemont and Bonnie's father. Bonnie saw her dad and ran to him while shouting, "Dad." When her father saw Bonnie, a smile appeared on his face and knelt to give his daughter a hug. "Greetings Meyer. Greetings Grace. I'm sorry about this, but they needed to talk to the two of you," said Professor Sycamore. Ash was the first to speak and he said, "Sir, Madam, Serena and Clemont and several other former friends of mine betrayed me and wanted me to give up my dream of becoming a Pokemon master." "What? My Clemont? Impossible," said Meyer as he placed Bonnie on the ground, who said, "It's true Daddy, he betrayed Ash." "And, my Serena too?" asked Grace. John nodded his head and he said, "Yes, Serena too. They both betrayed Ash and wanted to give up his dream, but Bonnie stood by Ash. Mr. Williams, she's a true friend." John then noticed that Meyer and Grace were wearing matching rings and asked, "What's with the rings?" Not to change the subject, but what is with the rings? Grace and Meyer realized that the jig was up, and Meyer rubbed the back of his neck and said, "Well, you see, Grace and I are kinda getting married." Bonnie's eyes began watering up with tears of joy and she ran to give her future mother a hug. I put the stepmother in, because Bonnie would just call her mom, not Grace. John smiled and said, "Congratulations you two." "Thank you, John," said Grace, as she stood up from giving her future daughter a hug. "Now back to the topic about Clemont and Serena betraying you." John nodded his head and said, "I agree, we don't know their reasons for betraying Ash, they just did. I'm sorry to have to tell you that." Grace held up her hand and said, "It's all right, I'm glad you told me about Serena." "That goes double for me about Clemont," said Meyer. "Now we just need to find Greninja and Shauna," said John. Ash agreed with him and Professor Sycamore said, "Why, Greninja is at my lab, helping my lab assistants watch the place while I was here." "Can we go there now to get him?" asked Ash. Professor Sycamore chuckled before he said, "Of course, I'll call the lab from and tell them that you're all going to show up there." "Thank you, Professor Sycamore. Let's go guys," said Ash, as he started to run towards Professor Sycamore's lab. They others had to run to catch up to him. Meanwhile back in Kanto, Misty and the other traitors arrived at Oak's lab only to realize that all of Ash's Pokemon were already gone. "My grandson and I already got them to Ash, so you couldn't turn them against him," said Professor Oak, who was tied up. Brock was the first traitor to speak and he said, Professor Oak, Ash is weak. We would have been better trainers for his Pokemon. Professor Oak then said, Ash caught all those Pokemon by himself. You didn't catch them, he did. Tracy then punched Oak in the stomach and said, Shut it, old man. Tracy, I am disappointed in you. I'm disappointed in all of you. You all traveled with Ash while on his journey. Through all the rough times, you all stuck with him up until he left the region he was in. And now you betray him. He saved the world countless times, gave his life so others could live on. I said, Shut it, old man. Said Tracy, while punching Oak in the stomach again. Oak then began to cough up blood. Delia ran up to Oak to patch him up and she said, Tracy, you need to stop punching Professor Oak in the stomach, he's starting to cough up blood. I know, Delia. That's what I want. Said Tracy in an evil way. Back with Ash and his friends, they just arrived at Professor Sycamore's lab. As Ash opened the door, he got jumped on by a Pokemon. Hi, Ash, said the Pokemon that jumped on him. Ash smiled and said, Hey Greninja, how have you been? Greninja said that he was doing fine and said, Professor Sycamore called and told his assistants to expect you and the others, but where are Serena and Clemont? Unfortunately, Greninja, they betrayed Ash, along with some of his friends. We're the only people who stood by him when the others tried to make him give up his dream of becoming a Pokemon master. Said John. Greninja could not believe it and said, Even their Pokemon. Ash smiled, shook his head and said, All but one from both of those traitors, but before I call out the Pokemon, what happened with Squishy and the evil root? Greninja told everyone that understood him that Squishy said that he could have a break and visit Professor Sycamore. Ash and Bonnie smiled, and Ash said, Now to get you reacquainted. Come on out, Braixen. As he threw Braixen's Pokeball. When it opened and Braixen came out, she opened her eyes and saw Greninja standing in front of her. Greninja! Shouted Braixen as she jumped into Greninja's arms. Greninja was happy that Braixen was still on Ash's side. Greninja, Braixen choose to join me since you're my Pokemon. Would you like to rejoin our team? Greninja nodded his head and said, You bet, I want to get back at those traitors. John, Ash, and Bonnie all smiled and Ash said, Welcome back to the team Greninja. Hey, Ash, said a voice. Ash, John, Bonnie, Sawyer, and Alon all recognized the voice, and when they all turned towards the direction the voice came from, they saw Shauna standing just a few feet away. Hi, Shauna, replied Ash. Shauna then walked over to John and said, You didn't call ahead. Sorry, babe. I forgot that my phone was in my bag. Replied John. Ash and the others had looks of surprise on their faces and Ash said, Hold on, you mean to tell me that you already told her that you love her? John smiled and said, Yup, we actually went on a couple of dates already. Then why didn't you tell us? Ash asked John with his face beginning to steam. Wanted to surprise you on your birthday, dude, but the betrayal of Clemont, Serena, and the others kind of stopped that. Wait, what do you mean betrayal? Asked Shauna. John told Shauna everything that happened in the past few hours. Shauna was shocked to hear that her fellow performer and best friend, Serena, betrayed Ash and tried to make him give up his dream of becoming a Pokemon master. Ash, I'm sorry to hear all of that, said Shauna with sympathy in her voice. Ash said that it was all right. Now that we told people here, where to next? Said John. The group was confused about where to go to next until Paul said, How about the Ootan region? I heard of the Ootan region, it has great beaches and is sunny most of the year. Said John. Paul then said, It's also far from the 7 core regions. You could create new strategies, Ash. Said May. Don't forget about the traitors, the farther away we are from them, the safer they will be. Said Greninja. True, we would be farther away from the traitors, Greninja, but going to the Ootan region could be the perfect way to get our revenge against the traitors. Replied John. Ash smiled at the fact of revenge and said, Revenge, sounds good to me. Alright, to the Ootan region we go. All of Ash's friends cheered and they started to make their way to the airport until Bonnie stopped them and said, Wait, what about Squishy? What about me? Said a voice that Bonnie recognized. When she turned towards the location of the voice, she saw Squishy and ran to him. Squishy! Bonnie shouted, as Squishy jumped into her arms and he said, "Hello Bonnie, it is good to see you all." John walked over to Bonnie and Squishy and said, "It's good to see you too Squishy, I'm sure you heard everything we told Greninja." Squishy nodded his head and said, "Yes I did, so I can't see any other reason not to allow Greninja to rejoin Ash's team, and before you ask, don't worry about us and the root problem, we can find them, it will just take longer. I hope you make those bastards pay for hurting Ash." Everyone tried to hold back the laughter after hearing Squishy curse. John then said, "Don't you worry Squishy, we will make them pay, every single one of them." Then, I must be off, my brother and I counted up that we still have a few dozen ore roots left to destroy. Good luck my friends, said Squishy before he hopped away to deal with the root problem. Bye Squishy, until we meet again, said Bonnie waving goodbye to Squishy. Ash then said, "Alright, next stop, the Ootan region." Everyone raised their fist in the air and they all got on a plane bound for the Ootan region.